philosophy of the founding era, and everything you have, the case against welfare. His presentation this evening is titled, A Country in Crisis, So What's to Be Done? Let's please welcome Dr. Jerome Huyler.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you for bringing me down tonight.
Sure.
Okay, I once read in a book that a good speaker knows who he's speaking to before he starts speaking. So let me see if I can identify what is in common with everyone sitting in this room and what brings you here, what makes you active in politics in the way you are. Well, I would say common denominator is you have a strong sense that the country is going in the wrong direction. And what you mean by that is that government is way too big, spends way too much, and is growing ever more intrusive in our lives at the expense of our freedom and at the expense of the prosperity that the next generation, our children, our grandchildren, hope to enjoy. You understand that taxes are strangling the private sector, strangling individual families, and on top of that, budget deficits drain, deplete capital, not allowing the opportunity to create or expand businesses. This too is a danger. In terms of a solution, I would just finish by saying you have the sense that the answer lies in reclaiming our founding principles, going back to our basic documents. With all of these positions, I am in total agreement with you, and I want to expand your universe of understanding, I hope, not to be too modest, in this talk. Okay, I'll begin by saying, well, lately I'm taking to speaking in tweets. They used to be called aphorisms 200 years ago. Now they're just called tweets. And so one tweet I send out is, I have an idea. Why not let conservatism do to D.C. what liberalism did to Detroit? Depopulate the place. And I'm very serious about that. Here is my first premise and major statement. The only thing that will save this country is if we wake our neighbors, enough of them, and send an army of Mr. Smiths to Washington to cut programs and close agencies. Cut and close, wholesale. By the way, no one is suggesting that as a solution. Let me go and break down the two parts of this statement. The only thing that will save us is to wake our neighbors and send an army of Mr. Smiths, and you're all acquainted with the movie I'm alluding to, an army of Mr. Smiths to Washington to cut programs and close agencies. Well, what on earth leads me to say that that's the only thing that will save us? Consider all of the good, honest, decent patriots who have alternative solutions that they say will save the country. There is the plan for a flat tax. Neil Bortz's idea of a fair tax. You're all acquainted with these. The idea of a constitutional amendment to balance the budget, that Congress cannot spend more than it takes in revenue. Another plan. And of course, Mark Levin has the idea of a convention of states to make such a balanced budget amendment along with 12 or so others, 11 or 12 others, that he refers to. There are those who run around the country telling us the solution lies in term limits. If you listen to Sean Hannity, any day of the week you will hear about Representative Connie Mack's penny plan, to simply cut 1 penny out of every item of the budget, and according to Representative Mack, we'll get to a balanced budget in 4 years, no problem. Well, these are some of the alternative solutions that I categorically reject. They deal in symptoms. High taxes is a symptom of what is taking place and has been in our country. The budget deficits that deplete capital, drain from the private market, that is a symptom. My basic rule is there is no safe way to finance the cost of runaway government. And it's runaway government, or to paraphrase, it's the spending, stupid. It's the spending that has to be attacked. Dealing with the consequences of the spending, whether you want tax reform or a balanced budget to end the deficits, these are the symptoms of the problem. No medical man will ever tell you he can cure a disease by dealing with the symptoms of that disease. The underlying cause is runaway government per se. That, in my view, is what has to be attacked. The only thing that will save us then is to wake our neighbors, send an army of Mr. Smiths to cut programs, close agencies. How do you do that? There are thousands of lines on the federal budget, hundreds and hundreds of agencies that are funding programs of every conceivable description. How do you get Congress to agree on massive cutting of spending when each congressman and senator has their own special interests who they pledge to support? And all you wind up having is a whole bunch of compromises. Well, let's take a few pennies from this. I'll give you that if you give me a few pennies from that. Amounts to nothing. The only way to attack a fundamental problem is to ask fundamental questions. Questions that have not come up in the public debates to date. I can think of three. One, what is government for? Fundamental question. Two, what must government do for us? I'm no anarchist. And what must we be expected to do for ourselves? Fundamental question. Three, the last one. When must a people say to their government, this far and no farther? What are the due, proper limits of political authority? These are the questions I've come here to answer. And I'm going to suggest that the problem in this country began very, very long time ago. And how we got from that point to this. Okay, if you want to think in basics, you can break down every single action governments take into one of two categories. Government can act as a protector or a provider. To the extent that government is a protector, it is protecting all of us. That is what equality under law means. Equal justice under law. We are protected in the enjoyment of what is ours. Our lives, our liberties, our possessions. The moment government appropriates 1 red cent to a function that does not serve to protect us all, in terms of military, police, hiring judges, building jails to protect us all from those who would violate our rights, the moment government goes beyond that and appropriates money not to protect us all, but to provide for some, inevitably, at others' expense, government becomes not a protector, but a provider. And whatever government is providing, in my book, it might as well be called welfare. Whether recipients are financial fat cats or family farmers, the old, the young, the rich, the poor, the healthy, the sick. Then government does not establish equal justice under law, but it establishes special privileges for some at others' expense. To me, this is corruption as such. And the more people get welfare, in this sense, broad sense, the more people expect welfare, and the more the politicians are happy to give, because they are concerned with one thing and one thing only, the unemployment problem. And to save their jobs, they'll do whatever it takes and say whatever it takes. Well, if that is my definition of welfare, anything government does that doesn't involve protecting us all in the enjoyment of what's ours, but benefiting some at others' expense, I ask you, to what can we trace the origins of the welfare state? Oh, it's your turn now, you can answer.
The creation of the IRS.
1913,
Yeah.
before that.
The creation of the.
Social Security comes after that in 35. No, go ahead.
When the government gave money to the railroads to begin with to develop the West and the East.
Excellent. The Transcontinental Railroad was certain, and boy, I know the entire story. I've published on it. It is corruption incarnate. Corporate corruption by what I call counterfeit capitalists. The Transcontinental Railroad, what a scheme. But you don't even have it right.
The creation of the Federal Reserve Bank.
Again, that's way later.
The Tariff Act of 1789.
Where'd you hear that?
Radio.
Well, at least you weren't the first to spill the beans. That's good. You let some others. Yes, that is exactly right. I trace the origins of the American welfare state to the second bill signed into law by our first president, the Tariff Act of 1789. Look how it worked. The moment in the spring of 1789, when the first Congress was assembled in New York City at the time, it received memorials, remonstrances, pleas from America's young manufacturing companies, mainly on the East Coast, mainly in Massachusetts and such, northern New York, for tariff protection. They said, we cannot compete with our European companies making the same products that we do because they've been at it for so long, they have economies of scale, whatever it was known as back then, and we need tariff protection. Congress was happy to give American manufacturers tariff protection, and so they erect high tariff walls, taxes in effect, for all goods coming into the United States. Why is that welfare? It's not giving anybody any money. Congress didn't do that. But as a result of that tariff legislation, companies, manufacturers in this country were able to raise their prices because they were protected from competition by the high tariffs. That got continually higher, I should add, through the entire 19th century. But if you were a farmer in the West or a planter in the South, you had to sell your crops in a politically unprotected market, getting whatever the market will bear. But the tools you bought, the buckboards, the wheels, the weapons, everything that was manufactured that you bought, you had to pay an artificially higher price, a politically induced higher price. If you were a seaport merchant making your living through a brisk transatlantic trade, well, many of your ships were simply idle at their wharfs. If Europe could not sell to us the manufactured goods to get the reserves, they did not have the reserves to buy the agricultural products mainly that we were shipping to Europe. And if you were an ordinary merchant mariner making your living as a seaman, well, you know what it was like to be unemployed. So you see, one class of Americans benefited by this intrusion in the free market, and so many other classes of Americans in all kinds of industries suffered as a result of this legislation. Well, you ask, what does that have to do with where we are today? How did we get from that point, that moment in the spring of 1789 to where we are today? I could break it down to 3 or 4 sentences, but you have to listen carefully. Once a nation decides that some of its citizens have a right not to go out and get, but to sit still and be given, it finds itself torn by 2 questions. Who should be given, and just how much should they get? There's only one answer: politics. Special interest politics. And you have, in American history, a perpetual clamoring for more forms of public assistance, welfare benefits, if you will, and the eagerness of politicians to put coalitions of special interests together to keep them in office. Once a nation decides that some of its citizens have a right not to go out and get, but to sit still and be given, it finds itself torn by those questions, and politics is the only answer. It's surprising that it took so long to get to the state where we are today, made possible by deficit spending, accumulated debt, which just this week hit $18 trillion, which will be $20 trillion, a noose around the necks of our children and grandchildren as far as we can see into the future. We are in a perilous state, and that perilous state requires fundamental reform, and lowering tax rates, making it a flat tax, getting rid of the IRS, impeaching the President of the United States, who deserves impeachment.
Yes.
But I recommend that we make no effort whatsoever impeaching the man who should be driven from office, but it's too much of a distraction. There is not enough time to save this country. We don't know what will be the trigger that will send us into another economic tailspin, a Great Depression. But no country with an $18 trillion debt, borrowing from China and other companies just to stay afloat and continue paying out the promissory notes successive Congresses have made, puts us in a perilous state. And in my view, the only thing that can pull us out of it is a great American welfare revolt. Now, in order to accomplish that, it's not enough just to say that, well, everything government does, it can do either as a protector or a provider. It is essential to delegitimize government's actions and functions as a provider, to delegitimize them. And that can be done. And the instinctive sense that it is by restoring our founding principles, by rereading and reinterpreting our founding documents, is the way to go. That instinct is exactly right. I'm going to take a little time now to explain the full meaning of the Declaration of Independence, the founding document of this country, in a way that I dare say you never heard it explained before. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Now, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What Jefferson left out, what he omitted to identify, are the specific rights that individuals have that they are therefore able to grant to government. And government can claim these rights because we had them originally and were able to delegate them. Jefferson never explained what those rights were. John Locke, the true founder of this republic, did explain that. And I want to go into limited detail of Locke's philosophy, and then you'll understand how the founding principles stand as a barrier, a towering barrier against all forms of public assistance and welfare. So, John Locke also identified the inherent, inalienable rights of man. He said they were four. Life, the right to live our lives. Well, that is simply the right to live our life is the right to liberty. That is what we do in living our life. We exercise our choices, our decisions, our predilections, our premises and values. But since we are material beings with a need for food and shelter and tools and weapons and so many other things, we must have the right to use our liberty, to engage in labor, and to keep what the 18th century called the just fruits of honest industry. In other words, from the right to life, we get the right to liberty. From the right to liberty, it is the right to labor and to gain, keep, use, and dispose of freely the just fruits of labor, which is the right of property. There's no one in the 18th century America who would deny the right to property, even though Jefferson changed that to the pursuit of happiness. And we understand why he did that also, but it's besides the point for now. Okay, there is only one other right that Locke says every human being is born with and cannot be taken away. It is the right to defend our three fundamental rights. It's the right of self-defense. In other words, John Locke begins speculating in a state of nature. He asks the fundamental question, why do governments come about? Why do we find them wherever we look? What are governments for? And so he says, well, let's imagine that there's no government. There is a community in some valley with families living peacefully and rationally with each other, trading as they please, with the rights, and they know them to be rights, to life, liberty, and to their possessions. Well, in that state of nature, there is nothing to say that a band of banditos, a gang of thugs, are going to jump down with more guns than anyone has and rob the entire community of what is theirs, their possessions, or murder them, or what have you. My best illustration of that is the movie Magnificent Seven. Yul Brynner, Steve McQueen, poor village south of the Texas border in Mexico, and Eli Wallach and his band of banditos come along just before the winter, rob all of the grain they were able to produce, leaving them enough to stay alive to produce more grain for the next winter, so the bandits will take it. So in a state of nature, it is untenable. We have these rights, but there's no guarantee they will be protected. Therefore, we have the right to defend what is ours from anyone who would steal them or kill us or harm us or threaten us, intimidate us in any way. The right of self-defense. Ladies and gentlemen, that is all Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington believed the people need to give to government to establish government. We have the right to defend ourselves. It's not practical to do it. We can't count on that. We need a central authority with a monopoly on the legitimate use of force, that's called the institution of government, in order to protect us. So governments are formed by the people, and by the people delegating the right we had originally, the right of self-defense, to government, to make government the protector of us all. And it's only proper and just and necessary that we be taxed to support the protection services we all depend on, need, and in fact enjoy. Well, my next question then, if anyone looks at the federal budget today, what percentage of spending goes to the protection services I briefly outlined?
Probably about 10%, maybe a little less.
Yes?
Does that like include national defense?
National Defense is a
Defense.
protection service that we need. We need the military. Those plates represent
Justice.
exactly what we need. We need the Department of Justice. We need jails and judges. We need a Federal Bureau of Investigation to investigate crimes that go beyond in states' borders. We need a CIA. And stop. That's it. We've just exhausted the functions government performs in protecting us and protecting us in what is ours. Well, that does represent 18%, 18 cents of every dollar the federal government is spending today. 18 cents of every dollar. 82 cents of every dollar the federal government is spending, never mind the states and municipalities, basically goes for public assistance of every imaginable form. To capitalist companies, Solyndra, the most egregious example in recent years, but bailing out Chrysler and bailing out General Motors and bailing out AIG and
Yeah.
Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, all of it, to me, fits one designation, and that is welfare. And I believe the only thing that will save us is delegitimizing all of those programs. But here's the point. Government derives its right from the people. Government gets its power from rights delegated by the people. No person may take or give what belongs to another. How could government ever claim such a power? No person ever had it, such a power, to take or give away what belongs to another, and government's rights derive from the
Yeah.
people, but no person had such a right to begin with. Government may not, in constitutional scrutiny or scruples, claim a power to take from Peter to pay Paul, or take from Paul to pay Peter.
But it's got a phone and a pen.
Yes, we're talking legitimacy now.
So
And,
legitimate power.
Or another way I put it in another tweet, if liberty equals labor, and the fruit of one's labor is one's property, then any act of welfare is an act of theft under cover of law.
Amen. Yep.
Yeah.
That is what I believe has to be attacked. That is the root of all of the branches and all of the twigs that spread out that are destroying the country. Okay. If you're with me now, I have two more points that I want to make. Realistically, what would your friends, your neighbors, maybe your relatives say of you if you told them, I just signed up to the Great American Welfare Revolt, and I want to reduce government to its proper role as our protector?
What do you think they haven't said over the last
Yeah.
5 years?
Well,
Yeah.
you know what
Right-wing
you would be
radical, Tea
saying.
Party, crazy anarchists.
Yeah.
Don't care about
Exactly,
the poor,
exactly so.
Don't care about the poor.
And so here
Social
is,
Security.
yes, Social Security is a special category. It absolutely is the heart and soul of the welfare state. But on the other hand, those who were promised benefits, paid for those benefits, were in a contractual arrangement, and so I would leave Social Security till the very end, after unwinding so many other agencies, getting rid of the clientele agencies, Department of Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Department of Education. Without touching Social Security, there's so much that can be eliminated. So many programs and services.
You get all these illegals that are going to take all the.
That is not the fundamental problem. See, I have, there is no problem with many illegals coming into the country who are working, as long as they're not receiving eligible for any benefits.
When they're in the hospital,
I know, and I'm against that, but I'm equally against any American citizen going to a hospital for free medical care and at other people's expense. In other words, it's a principled stand against all forms of wealth distribution and the transfer of income that has to be attacked at its root. And that saves you to an extent from being called a racist, because you're not called a racist if you're against Goldman Sachs getting bailed out or General Motors. But it's even more than that. Ladies and gentlemen, I know who you are. You know who you are even better. Americans are the most generous, giving, kind, compassionate people who've ever peopled the earth. It is a libel on the United States, on every citizen in this country, to suggest that in the absence of a welfare state, millions of Americans will suffer for want of a helping hand. There is not a smidgen of historical evidence to support that libel. In a free and therefore prosperous society, there will always be sufficient benevolence, generosity, and goodwill, the spirit of Christmas that's coming upon us, to provide for those few in any generation who truly can provide for themselves. And all I ask you to think about is all the telethons and all that was done for Jerry's kids, every Labor Day all the year. And I'll just leave it at that, and I could be here for the rest of the month telling you the equivalent of that.
I would argue that it is the welfare state that has depleted the benevolence on two fronts. Number one, because we have so much less of the fruits of our labor, we can afford to be less generous.
Exactly.
Number two, if anybody's seen the movie Scrooge, what happens when the carolers come knocking on the door and they say, "Alms for the poor"? What does he say? "Are there no poorhouses? Is that not where my taxes go?" It relieves us as moral, caring human beings from the obligation to help our fellow man because the government will do it.
Including with
Right.
the advent of Social Security, what came with the advent of Social Security was the advent of families no longer taking care of their elderly parents
Yeah.
and grandparents. Now it was the government's job.
Right.
And so that was social dislocation on a massive scale. The point, let me finish, because, and I'm going to be here to answer,
Okay.
I'm going to be here till the very last question is asked and answered, even if it takes till Sunday. Now,
We won't be here, but you
the
can.
the principle then is, in a welfare harms most the very people it's designed to help. And not only for that reason, it drains so much money that good, compassionate people would otherwise be happy to give to charity, give to their neighbor, the food kitchens and so forth. But the welfare state, through its policies of taxation and public borrowing, depleting so much capital, and the deficits and debt it incurs, strips the opportunity away that millions of people now receiving public assistance would otherwise have. In other words, in the ghetto communities, why there is such unreason, why there is such violence, criminality and all, is that you have destroyed the opportunity, and you've also destroyed the possibility of being educated to learn a trade or get the skills needed to gain gainful employment. And the taxes and the deficits have drained capital and incentive out of the market that would have otherwise left those businesses free to hire those people who quote unquote need assistance. Let me finish. Again, welfare harms most the very people it intends to help. And if anyone calls you a racist or a cold-hearted, knuckle-dragging Neanderthal for suggesting that we would be much better off without a welfare state, that is all you need to say. To plug my book, I haven't done that yet, all of these arguments and all of this case is all really written in plain English and presented chapter by chapter by chapter in the book. This is a talk based on just summarizing material that I presented in the book. Finally, I don't want to make light of what I'm suggesting. If the Tea Party grows, and it's my view that things will have to get far worse in this country in order for your neighbors to be willing to hear what is wrong and what has to be done. Things must get worse before they can get better. But I believe our neighbors, as politically disengaged and apathetic as they are, they love this country. They love the liberty they enjoy. They simply take it for granted. They make the simple mistake that all they have to do is work real hard and they'll be able to pay their bills, and if they leave government alone, government will leave them alone. Well, I just came from a week in Greene County, New York, where the word politics is not spoken from one end of the county to the other, and these people live in utter hardship, just fending for themselves day by day. More Americans' backs are against the wall, and they realize that it is impossible to live because what government is doing. I believe they will be an army of individuals who, good folks like yourselves, will be able to reach at that point. Okay, my last point then is that if the Tea Party can grow, and I believe that the Tea Party is the last and only hope, and there are no exceptions to that. I don't look to any politicians in any political party whatsoever. It's good people like you who maybe 8 years ago never spelled the word politics, but who finally realized what government is doing to the quality of your lives and what you can expect it to do to the quality of your children's and grandchildren's lives, that have brought you to groups like this, brought Americans into the Tea Party movement. But if you can garner whatever it will take to become part of a great American welfare revolt, reducing government to its only proper role as our protector, not any provider, this is serious business. This will create massive dislocation. Think of all the bureaucrats whose jobs will be lost in the process. There will be hell to pay in the short run. I liken it to a junkie who's been a heroin addict for 10 years. There's no way he or she can get clean without suffering the pangs of withdrawal, and they are hurtful. But he knows that once you come out the other end of that suffering you have to endure, you will live a clean life. You will have all the opportunity this country gives us, used to give us. And so, not to make light of what I'm suggesting, the implications and consequences of a massive popular movement to end the welfare state, on the other side of that, there will be incentives for capital to come to this country from all over the world, because this is the place that will announce once again, as it did in 1789, America is open for business, and you will keep and enjoy the fruits of your honest industry and just labor. And that will create an inflow of capital, an expansion of jobs, and economic opportunity that will make the suffering shorter, as well as the energy revolution that's taking place, and the opportunity for so many millions of jobs to be created, steel industry, transport industry, what's going on in North Dakota and Texas, Midland, Texas today, tens of thousands of jobs being created, cities springing up out of wilderness, like it did after the Civil War for the next 50 years. It's happening again because of the fracking and energy revolution. So we have great resources to sustain ourselves. Simply a matter of getting government out of the way and remembering the first thing I ever wrote and published. A nation is as great as it is free. Economic prosperity, freedom's fruit, is simply the material expression of a nation's greatness and its greatest practical reward. I'll finish there.
Yeah, I have a question for you, because although I agree with pretty much everything you said there, there is one other category that potentially is a legitimate function of government. And that, I've always described the purpose of government is to protect us, but is also to provide those services that we all agree should be provided and are most efficiently provided at that level. Things like building bridges and the highway system and infrastructure type things. I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Oh, okay. I believe there were sufficient experiments, and if you go to Heritage Foundation and Cato Institute, a lot of the scholars there have done the historical work showing how private enterprise was easily able to build turnpike roads and bridges and even tunnels and thoroughfares. Entire developments were built, towns and villages were built as private enterprises, and people came, and so I think less is necessary for government than we imagine. An interstate highway system like Eisenhower created towards the end of his administration, even things like that, turnpike roads like that and major highways can be built as profitable enterprises. I'm not an expert on that, and I would never say that the government has no role whatsoever. I can't conclude that. I don't have the information to conclude that, but I would look at that as a possibility. And you have got to hold government as strictly as possible to its role as a protector, because the avalanche of spending that goes, the snowball down the hill, is too great once government goes beyond that strict purview.
It is interesting. I'll just, somebody else jump in a second. One of the exercises I did was read all the State of the Union addresses from Washington all the way up through the Civil War. And one of the things I remember distinctly, right in the early 1800s, I think it was Monroe, and they was petitioning Congress, because although they had the right in the Constitution to build post roads,
Yeah, right,
okay,
right.
it was actually a matter of survival that they needed to build roads from the coast where they would have to fight off bandits to the frontier where they would have to fight Indians so they could move troops. And he didn't have the authority in the Constitution to do it. So there he is pleading with Congress in the State of the Union address for the authority to do so, because even though it's a matter of survival, he couldn't possibly think of doing it because it wasn't authorized in the
It was
Constitution.
the issue of internal improvements. The Maysville Road was one, but the whole thing is, once Congress gave authority and appropriated money for that, that is what brings us to not only the Erie Canal in New York, but a spate of internal improvements with canalways that blow up and become the Depression of 1937. And then the Depression of 1957, after the cycle is repeated again and again. And then it becomes the impetus for the Transcontinental Railroad, which, as Andrew Carnegie said, I don't understand this business about building railroads from nowhere to nowhere at public expense. Well, it was the business of very well-connected bankers who got Congress to pass the bill, and the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific got between $18,000 and $32,000 for every mile of track that they laid, depending if it was on flat land, between mountain ranges, or over a mountain range. Plus, they got 10 miles of land on either side of the tracks, and this is the land that was going to be most valuable. And once the railroad was completed in 1872, there was no one who was using the railroad to go out west. There were no farmers and planters and ranches to bring cattle back to the east. And so the railroads went bankrupt and took the entire economy of the country. The first Great Depression, and it was called a Great Depression, was the Depression of 1872. And all of that comes as a result of doing something that seems essential to the security of the frontier and everything, allowing government to get involved in that. It's just like the housing bubble that was blown up and then burst in September of 2008. Government does something with a specific purpose, and the more successful it is, the more it's allowed to go further and further and further until the bubbles burst. Let the economy grow at a natural pace. Not, in other words, the ironic thing is, government does more harm when it tries to help the economy than when it's actually hurting the economy. The bubble is great.
Yeah.
And to be honest, I used to be a DJ. I paid my way through graduate school as a club day DJ. I used to do 6 AIG parties a year. Hank Greenberg would be there at the Marriott Financial District, right next to the World Trade Center, and he'd say how great AIG is doing, insuring and guaranteeing all of the bundles of mortgages and the REITs and everything. And they were making a fortune, and I was doing parties for the international division, the legal division, the security division, and everyone, until it all burst, came to an end, and the entire economy with it. So you really, I don't know the full answer, but when you start something, it's almost worse if it succeeds than if it fails. If it fails, it's over, done. If it succeeds, just like midnight basketball. A couple of well-meaning pastors, reverends, started the practice out of their desire to help the kids in the local community who they knew, and government said, "That's great, let's do it too." And midnight basketball became a fiasco and just a cesspool of money poured into it, accomplishing nothing at all. And now look what Chicago's like. Go ahead.
You speak of the proper role of government in protecting us, but as we move away from federal and we get more local, in your perspective, does that change? I'm talking about things like schools, traffic lights, parks. for
No,
example.
it doesn't change at all. Again, we have a system of public roads and traffic lights and regulations. To be very honest, I haven't done any thinking on how to dismantle a road system, a traffic system, to fire all of the meter maids and all. So I don't know. But yes, the principle is the same. Government, whether on a local, state, or federal level, gets its powers from the consent of the governed, and the governed has no power to give away someone else's money, so government may not claim that, whether it's local, state, or federal.
So the example.
That's why the least of my interest is in defending the principle of federalism, which is certainly very important. But whenever I hear anybody defending federalism, the rights of states, they will give the states rights that they will never give the federal government. And me, I don't care who's taking away my rights. Leave me alone. Get off my back and out of my
In the case of
pockets.
education, you're suggesting complete privatization.
Yeah, I would.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yep.
Tomorrow, if not sooner.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Was the welfare system originally put in place as a temporary? I mean, it's become like a way of life. I mean.
Well, yeah,
unfortunately.
absolutely. For Franklin Roosevelt, who inaugurates the New Deal and the first real strong welfare system, including Social Security and the roots of Medicare and everything, he thought it was terrible to keep this as a permanent basis. He thinks it undermines the incentive for people to work. It gives them no incentive at all. He thinks it's very bad, but under the circumstances of the Great Depression, what else could you do with 25% of the workforce just totally out of work? And so crisis is the catalyst of change, and the worse things get, the worse solutions are thought up to solve the problems that government itself created. Another principle, which I'm involved in demonstrating now in the published work, is that there's one fallacy everyone or no one knows is a fallacy. It is not true that capitalism has a business cycle, a cycle of booms and busts. That is absolutely false, and yet there isn't an economist in business that would deny the fact that there is a business cycle, that there are booms and busts. Yes, there are booms and busts, and I happen to have studied all of the depressions this country endured. And in every case, I can point to the specific welfare policies government instituted that first blew the bubble of economic success up until it burst. Usually the Federal Reserve pouring money in the economy that goes into the stock market or goes into public construction or housing programs and the building of hospitals, and eventually when the money stops coming, we see that there was a tremendous over-construction that was not justified by the economics of the time, and that is the Depression. So there's nothing in a private market economy that itself will lead to depressions and business cycles. Ludwig von Mises showed that in Human Action. Friedrich Hayek explained that in The Road to Serfdom, in other words. And by the way, the title of the book is Everything You Have, and you might remember Gerald Ford debating Jimmy Carter in 1976,
Government big enough.
warned the country that a government that's big enough to give you anything you want is big enough to take everything you have.
Yeah.
That was the inspiration for the title, and the basis of the book says, it is not only our prosperity we will forfeit in the scramble for public assistance, but our liberties as well. And that's becoming ever more evident to anyone paying attention. Yes, your hand has been up.
With the EPA, would you limit them or eliminate them?
Eliminate them.
Eliminate them.
Get rid
Get
of
them
them.
out of there.
Get rid of them.
And by the time I leave this hall,
Yeah.
they should be done away with. Doors closed.
Unfortunately, there are 25,000 more regulations before you leave the room.
Give them a chance to defend themselves.
There's a slight problem that with the EPA and with big business. Remember GE what they did with the waterways, with the Hudson River.
The Love Canal.
Yeah.
If you don't,
Love Canal
if you
does not
are
apply.
not able to regulate business, they will go wild.
On the contrary,
Really?
really.
Go ahead.
Here, and, okay, hang on to your seat.
Go ahead.
Business today looks at the EPA regulations as simply another cost of doing business.
Yes.
No one goes to jail. It's just money that comes out of the shareholders' pockets.
You're absolutely
What
right
you
on.
do with a company that is polluting the air, pouring toxic chemicals into the air or into the groundwater that's going 25 miles downstream and affecting people's houses, you do not fine them. You arrest them and indict them on reckless endangerment or attempted murder. And then pollution stops dead in its tracks.
I agree with you, but you need the EPA or the government to...
No, you don't. You simply need the kind of attorneys, the kind of law firms that deal with the kind of research institutes that can document the specific danger that comes from a company polluting. In other words, I don't care if the CEO of Monsanto gets on his roof with a shotgun and starts blasting his neighbors, or instead of using a shotgun, uses a chimney and the smokestacks to accomplish the same thing. That guy is violating the rights of his neighbors who have a right to be left alone and not medically harmed. And
Right.
once you have screaming headlines in all the papers of how the CEO of General Motors or fill in the blank is now going to be spending 35 years in prison, where his children and grandchildren will be visiting him for violating the rights and recklessly endangering the public safety, then there's no more danger to the
Yeah.
public safety.
A lot of them need to go to jail.
Yes. But if you think there's a hole, a flaw,
The problem is,
excuse me.
you're right in what you're saying, I agree with you 100%, but the reason that a lot of companies will not go to court is because they know the government has the resources and the attorneys to tie them a long time. You as a practical
Don't call me practical, I'm a professor.
You as an attorney, a lot of these companies are settling because they know they can't beat the government. The cost is huge. So if it's huge for these companies, what is it going to be for a regular citizen? They'll run all over us. You still need the EPA.
No.
And you need it the way you said it. You got to change what they're doing, but you do need...
Nope.
Yeah.
All you need is a criminal justice system and a civil justice
But that's
system.
government. Criminal justice system is the government. The DA, the local DA is the government.
Right,
We
exactly.
need that.
And we need the government because the government, in the form of a district attorney, is who has to protect our rights from those who will violate them. Whether they're carrying a Glock or whether they're spewing toxic chemicals out of a chimney. Now, also, there is legal reform. There are things that can be done. There are ways in which if a jury finds the government's case frivolous, the government pays the full attorney expenses for that company that it maliciously maligned and falsely accused.
But again, the
There are
local
answers.
DA does
Yeah.
not have the money in the capital. He just doesn't.
Who doesn't?
The local DA goes against GE. GE will bury them because the local DA does not have...
That's the system as it is today.
Yes,
That's not true in criminal matters. And it need not be true. There are ways of running that. What the EPA is doing now is the only thing that's really criminal regarding the environment. Well, the claims it's making, and there's no possibility of changing on global warming, climate change, getting rid of an entire coal industry. If that's the alternative, then I'm not for it. Yes.
From everything that you've said, I don't really see any solution to this like in the near future. Like I always say to my husband, I wonder if we'll be around to see really any changes. Because I keep waiting for the spark. I keep waiting for the people to get up in arms.
Good word.
Sparks right here.
In,
You're asking where the tipping point is.
Sparks
yeah,
right
like,
here.
when are the people going to march to
Okay,
Washington?
here's my
We
answer.
already did.
Here's my answer.
it's
No, hold it.
something-
When I published the book, I said my ambition is to make a big splash in a small pool. Because it's a very small number of Americans, represented by exactly everyone in this room, that understands the peril that the country is facing and the consequences of not doing anything. But that is a tiny, infinitesimal percentage of the population, I agree. So here's my answer. Can we save ourselves? I'm not sure.
Oh, don't
I
know.
can't
Yeah,
offer
either.
any confidence, but I can say this, if I'm right about knowing my fellow Americans. As I said in the talk, Americans love this country. They love their liberty. They will, when their backs are against the wall, and when there is no longer an alternative, and they see government as the threat that we all see it to be, then they will be open to our ideas and our cajoling and our informing them and educating them. And I have an essay that was published on the American Thinker. Let's hear it for the low information voter. And the tweet that I linked to it says why the low information voter may be liberty's best kept secret weapon. And it's a long article. It's all the evidence I've marshaled to show that Americans will not forfeit their liberty once they see that it's their liberty, it's their prosperity that is at dire risk. And the best illustration of that I can give is 9/11. Think of what you saw when you woke up 2 days later on that Thursday. There is no place you did not see an American flag.
Yes.
Why? What it represented, all of those flags on every car antenna, every porch, every rooftop, in front of every business, in most businesses' windows, what that represents is the idea of America's love for liberty.
7
And-
years after they elected a president with the middle name Hussein.
Yeah.
Well, they
Yeah.
went to, no, the Americans went back to sleep a long time before that election. But while they were under the threat of terrorism, once they realized they might cross the George Washington Bridge, but there's no guarantee they would get over to the other side to New Jersey alive, and they felt that immediate terror and danger and peril, what Americans discovered, what they realized, whether they said it to themselves or not, if we are not safe, we cannot feel free. Americans at that moment lost their sense of safety, of security, and no longer felt free. And the flying of the American flag was Americans' desire to keep their freedom and to fight any power on earth that would destroy their safety and therefore their liberty. And that is why the recruiting offices were swelled to overflowing with young Americans signing up to make sure their parents and their children and their grandchildren and grandparents would remain free and safe in the United States.
The problem is what Churchill said, though, democracies won't act until there's blood in the streets, right?
I don't remember him saying that. He said that Americans will adopt every single solution that fails before they will find the one that they'll accept as one will work.
And how many people have government jobs too? What percentage of
There you
people
go.
are in nice, cozy, comfortable, government jobs?
Well, that's the fourth branch of government. That's really running everything.
Yeah,
We have a big percent, more and more,
and
there's
they
more people in
empowered by
government.
the first branch of government Congress, which writes broad legislation and gives the bureaucracies wide discretion in interpreting the legislation. Yeah, that is a danger. And I remember Frances Fox Piven, you're familiar with her, a socialist and all. I remember listening to her lectures when I was an undergraduate at Brooklyn College, and her strategy to bring socialism to America consisted of building the welfare class and the bureaucrats who administer the welfare programs. And her idea was, if we can get these two bodies of Americans to overpower the rest of the sleepy, apathetic Americans, socialism, here we come. And Frances Fox Piven, with the presidency of Obama, proved her theory brilliantly. Yes?
Well, a few things. One quick thing was when you were talking about the private industry doing the roads rather than the government. Perfect example.
Real estate
not so many
developers.
Years ago when Trump did the ice skating rink.
Yeah.
When he took
The city couldn't get that thing to stay dry after 5 years.
But what I wanted to say is, back in the 40s, you all remember,
Yeah.
you didn't have welfare per se, and as it was, you had home relief.
Right.
And I remember growing up in Brooklyn, if you wanted home relief, first of all, you were ashamed to be on it, because you had a real dire straits to be on it. And they sent people to your home, unannounced. You had a phone that was you, and you were off. And you didn't want to be on it anyway, so you got a job, any job as fast as you can, because you were ashamed. Your self-worth, your value as a person, and a provider, you know, family. It's called pride. That made you get off it forthwith. Now, it's a badge of courage.
Yeah.
Ultimately, what's going to happen, in my opinion, and we're getting close, this seesaw is already shifting to the wrong side. You're going to have a country where, first of all, the government produces nothing. The money that the government is giving out, of course, is our money. So ultimately, we're not going to have any money to give. So we're all going to go down the same, and that's going to be the solution. And then we're all going to be.
Well, that's not going to be. That's not a solution.
Well, it's not just, well,
that is chaos, mayhem, anarchy, street violence.
But mayhem is what's
coming.
being
And then they want us to beg them to
Look
help
at
us
Ferguson,
get it
Missouri,
out.
that's mayhem. You have a government calling for mayhem.
That's why you have to
yeah.
fix the bastard.
Look at all these things we
But-
have going on.
Ferguson, Missouri, again, they represent the American people less than the Tea Party does. As small as the Tea Party is, this is a tiny movement. They were around in the 60s, they were around in the 70s.
Except for Fox and the New York Post, listen to read
You're
everything
talking about
out
the
there.
media. We
It's
know
all
what can't
Ferguson, an armed man.
Yeah.
I give up. That's what it is.
No,
all it
Hands
means.
up.
They're bigger than us.
Americans still have common sense. The more they play up
Common sense. They elected
travesty,
Obama twice. What common sense do they have?
enough common sense to know, in the face of the witnesses before the grand jury, the autopsy results and everything, if they still come along with Michael Brown had his hands in the air, he was shot in the back, Americans will see through that. They can't see through Barack Obama, who speaks so well and is the greatest orator since
Hitler.
Since Adolf Hitler.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair.
You know, in Ferguson, Missouri, they burned down all these private businesses because they were upset. But they did not burn down the welfare office. They kept the welfare office standing there.
Is that right?
Yeah.
In the first place.
They kept up the welfare office.
By
they
the way,
kept social services. I mean, you know, I was a volunteer, so.
On Ferguson, I think the real lesson of Ferguson, and it's the scariest thing that I can think of, is the rise of the rule of unreason.
Yes.
The rise of the rule of unreason.
It's
The people themselves
Yes.
are so dejected,
Yes.
lacking all self-esteem, being in the ghetto, really, or another tweet that I have is, liberal compassion consigns able-bodied men and women to an effort-free wonderland of stigmatized indigence. an effort-free wonderland
They're not
of
stigmatized.
stigmatized indigents, because stigmatized, they know they are able-bodied, they know they are capable of working as much as anyone, and they refuse to, and they just are leeches and sponges off of the public trout,
why you
but
need
they
to
know it.
impeach Obama.
And indigents, because no one
You
ever
got
got
your
wealthy
say
on
no.
welfare.
Stop.
All you gotta do is watch Andrew McCarthy on the political case. Impeachment is a political device, and until you've convinced the people to do it, any effort to do it is foolhardy and will end in disaster. Look up, there's a video up there, I shot it when
As
he
with
spoke to the
everything
Federalist
you
Society.
EPA uses the courts, okay?
Listen to me,
for their
before you
case.
scream about
You need
it,
to take him down.
use
You need to take
comments,
this bastard down.
whatever, good luck with that.
Did you see?
In my view, it's justified, and I've done a whole article, these political crimes are significant, crimes against the Constitution. But
It's not a vigilante.
it's a distraction, and we can't afford spending years doing things that just
it's
simply
doomed to
allow the
fail.
You gotta
government to
stop him.
grow.
Since the election, you got Ferguson, the incitement of Rising Ferguson. Since the election, this amnesty thing. You gotta stop this guy. So you gotta stop.
You
this
can't.
now.
There's no somehow. Somehow thinking accomplishes nothing. It's not productive. And you should not, you should not be spreading that, because that will slam and damn every person in this room with you presenting a brash idea like that. Go ahead.
You mentioned about cajoling.
In my opinion.
Come on.
Fellow Americans.
One person.
And what time will they wake up and realize the country's in dire danger? And I would say to you that a lot of people in this room already know, we have a corrupt media
Yep. Oh, yeah.
who's defending this man and defending the institutions. And I said 10 years ago,
Yeah.
if Joseph Goebbels were alive today, he would be green with envy. How the American news media
He would be
mastered
Obama's
the-
communications director.
have mastered the art of propaganda.
They have.
Because you're dealing with a media that is stereo, that is anybody who's Tea Party, they've condemned, they've libeled. And why people will not embrace these ideals is because the media is working against us.
That's what I.
That's certainly true, but that is not fundamentally what's wrong. The media simply get their marching orders from the professors, from my colleagues. That's where the rot begins. It's the professors in the universities that teach the next generation of judges and journalists and playwrights and Hollywood actors and everything,
But the
and
people,
they get their
the
views.
people who own the media, that's what you have to go after. Those are the people. Because it's in their interest to create what's going on in this country. Because that's why they want legalized marijuana. They want to make people as stupid as possible. So they can rule them much easier.
That's true. There's no denying that. That's been the socialist utopian dream forever.
Well,
but the saving grace, what will save us, is the apathy of the American people. Is precisely the apathy of and disengagement of the low information voter, who is getting the newspaper every day, but turning right to the sports page, thank heavens, or to the entertainment section. No, and I'm serious about this. But if you want to look kindly on your apathetic neighbors, consider this. There are 3 roots of political apathy. One is cynicism. They know their politicians, their political leaders to be scum. Nothing but scum who will lie to them and tell them anything they want. That is one of the reasons they stay away from politics, yes. The second reason, unfortunately, is skepticism. I tried to watch a news show, and I had the conservative, and everything he said sounded right until the liberal spoke, and everything he said sounded right. How am I supposed to know? I can't figure it out, and so they turn away. The third is pragmatism. They can't see or feel the impact of the laws that are being passed. They don't make the connections. So they are not as far from us as we think, and I don't believe the average American is brainwashed. He's just taking out the garbage, driving the kids to soccer practice or the Girl Scouts. and trying to make ends meet,
But
pay
their
the mortgage at the end of the
political
month.
views
Their
are
children are
brainwashed,
brainwashed, but
for the
they're
most part.
Who?
Their political views are brainwashed.
I think that
He's
across
saying
the
they don't
country,
have deeply held political views
Yeah.
because they're disengaged.
they're disengaged. There's no position that they can defend. They mouth things to fit in, but these are not convictions. I don't believe most Americans, not yet, have been indoctrinated or brainwashed, not by the
There's a
public
different
schools and not by
brainwashing.
the media.
Unless they have material things, they're no good. This is what the media has done since they
No,
instituted.
human nature has done that.
No, I don't think so.
We
Because people used to go, they
love the
There used to be
material
families-
benefits.
The families would stay together, they would write letters, they would do all kinds of things together until they put the boob tube in the house. That's when things got bad.
It's a little
Because they
bit too
started
conspiratorial,
putting out all
if
this
you ask me.
propaganda. I do, but I know what I know. I'm smart enough to know not to believe it.
Okay, anyone who has not spoken yet, yeah.
You were talking about the tipping point. The tipping point is, you go back to the $18 trillion in debt. The social welfare system is based on the government spending more money than it's taking in. This is accumulated. Once we pass $20 trillion, any spike in the interest rate will make our federal government insolvent.
Absolutely so,
And
that's
at
correct.
that point, that's when they start cutting off the welfare checks.
Nah, they just print more.
And when they cut off the welfare checks, what do you think?
Well, hold on. First of all, there's no sum, 20 trillion or 22 trillion, there's no sum that can tell us what, you call it a tipping point, I like to speak in terms of a trigger. What will trigger the next severe crisis? Equal, if not greater than, September 2008. What that trigger is, I don't know. But there's one thing I know that gives credit to your view, and that is what is going on today and has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years. Under quantitative easing, the Federal Reserve is expanding the money supply, and I ask you then, how come prices aren't spiking the equivalent of how much money is being poured into the economy? Actually, I know the answer. The answer is that the money is going to the banks that are borrowing that money from the Federal Reserve at 0% interest, and what are they doing with the money? They're buying the public debt. They're buying treasury notes to sustain the $500 billion deficits a year that are being chalked up. By the way, Obama's responsible for 70% of the accumulated debt. 70% of the accumulated debt came since 2009, his first month in office. Now, that is as dangerous as anything I can think of. And exactly as you say, once interest rates spike, there'll be an inability, never mind the federal government. Detroit went bankrupt. What if Sacramento goes bankrupt? What if Albany, New York falls into bankruptcy because it can't afford the expense of borrowing more money to pay for its
It's a
deficits?
series of dominoes. And
Oh
as
yeah,
they fall,
oh yeah.
These people who
And with the
live in-
stock market operating at the speed of light, the fear, the terror, could tear this country down in hours.
Yes.
Well,
And that's a
I
realistic.
would stay out of the inner cities when it's.
I'll tell you, it would have to be
Get out of New York State.
because of,
Although, having spoken to some oath keepers, you want to buy a house in a community with retired military and law enforcement there. You'll be pretty safe. I myself, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm telling anyone who will listen to me that in 4 years, my community of Borough Park will be a gated community. God bless the Shamrim, the Orthodox Jews who have a private patrol, and no one fools around with them, not even the police.
Like Seagate, like Seagate.
Like Seagate.
I've got a question here.
If there is a Seagate after Sandy. Yeah,
Yeah, you know, we're talking about all this. When that happens, what do we do as concerned?
it's every man, woman, and child for himself.
Not quite.
No, what happens is we band together for mutual protection. To protect us, the innocent, from the thugs and the looters and the mooches.
Thank you, Ayn Rand.
To the extent possible. What did you
I
say?
said thank you, Ayn
Did
Rand.
you say thank
The
you? Ayn
looters
Rand?
and the moochers, you know.
She is my greatest influence.
In New York, there are regular.
Make our own orders.
Oh, hold it. Talk about anarchy. Come on, we're limited government people, not anarchists. Okay, another one.
You say that there are many problems that are occurring in the United States. Why not us write position papers, 1 or 2 pages, very concise, and start giving it out to try and educate the other people?
We've tried.
Let
People
them-
don't listen.
Let them see what we're positioned.
ready to hear
tried.
this. I mean,
Are you
I've
new
been
at
in
this
the
game,
that
Marcus?
business
I've
for
been doing
30
that for
years.
6
If
years.
you can show me how.
We tried to.
I haven't seen one.
Summer of 2009, handing out flyers against HR 3200, okay?
Yeah, I know,
You know,
speaking of Ayn Rand had a principle of communication. You can only, you have to wait to tell somebody something they need to hear, but you have to wait till they're ready to hear it. That was the
Yeah.
whole story of John Galt's rebellion. That's why he couldn't get Dagny on board for so long, because she wasn't ready to hear it, not even from Hank
I don't
Ridden.
understand how they're not ready to hear it. You know, it's everything is just so
Because
in
they're
your
not
face.
paying
No!
attention.
Think
You're
of
a
it, think of
political
it.
junkie.
Go
6 years.
go to a shopping center. Everyone is happy shopping for Christmas. What the
I
gifts
know,
they're giving their kids. Life is normal. Life is wonderful. They don't feel the peril that we're in. You have to use your imagination. You have to be aware of things. They have their heads in their sand. And like I said, they are so turned off by their politicians. They have such contempt and disgust for the average politician, which is very well deserved. But in that frame of mind, who wants to listen to a politician or even care about politics? They have their private lives and their private problems to deal with, and the kid needs
Until they
tooth
don't.
surgery. Until they don't, and that's the scariest part of all, because there's, at that point, reason is out the window, and you have the demagogues.
Somebody once said to me, forget silver, forget gold. When that point happens, ammunition will be the coin of the realm.
You haven't said one thing tonight since I met you that I don't completely agree with, and half of them I don't even have an answer to. It's just,
That's
it
why
stands by
ammunition's so
itself.
high now.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, one of the reasons I think it's difficult for people to understand is because we talk in terms of the government. If everything that's going on now, if you want to educate people, you talk in terms of family, because it's no different. If somebody comes into your house and takes your stuff, now you're talking about my family. It's everything, every situation is saying, but it has to be related in a realistic, this is your home, and this is what's happening to you and your family. Somebody's sticking their hand in your pocket
Yeah.
and taking your money, you wouldn't let that happen.
That's exactly
But when
right.
you say it's the government is providing, it's still my money,
Yeah. Or just
People
ask
have
a
to learn
person
by
to
thinking
collect
locally.
6 of their last pay stubs and see how much taxes were taken out of money that was paid to them by their employer that they should have been able to use, and what would the
But they
quality
have
of
to
their life be if they had kept that sum of money taken out in the last 6
They have to
paychecks.
take the national picture and make
No,
it into your family.
Your point is exactly right. Over Thanksgiving, one of my in-laws, their kid, he's all in school and all lefty, and he's talking about amnesty. Well, you can't be mad against the immigrants themselves. They're just coming here for, they're starving. They're just coming here because they have no opportunity. I said, so okay, your neighbor next door is starving. He's gonna break into your house and take your food, and now your kids are starving. Am I not gonna feel bad for this guy?
Your country is your house.
As a matter of fact, as I started saying, I use an example of, imagine a family across the street from you. They built an in-ground pool last summer, just beautiful. They let all the kids in the neighborhood use it. They have a Lexus right next to their Hummer, and you think they're really well off. They did it all on credit. They owe so much money. If one of the 2 breadwinners of the family lose 3 weeks worth of work, their entire prosperity is going to be repossessed. That's the state the country is in. they can go along for a long time, they can enjoy the swimming pool in the yard, they can drive their Hummer and their off-road vehicles upstate New York to their heart's content this year, next year, the next year. But what happens with being that much in debt
Somebody
if their
gets
source
sick.
of income is just interrupted for 3 months?
But it's easily understood on a personal
Yeah,
level.
and the country is in the exact same position. That we can continue, like Ayn Rand said, a wounded animal doesn't die immediately. He can continue in his state of illness for months, maybe years, but it doesn't mean he's healthy. And it doesn't mean that the consequences will not catch up to causes. But that is excellent, and there should be whole workshops in communicating ideas. But the one thing I can say is, keep your ear to the ground. Whenever you hear of a neighbor or a coworker or a colleague, or you're in a dentist office or whatever, and you hear someone who apparently doesn't know a lot about politics, but they're starting to see how it's affecting them, jump on it.
I do it all the time.
Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah.
10 people a day.
Then then if we can do that and build it in our communities, then we can spread the word, organize, and especially when there is some danger, some real peril that becomes exposed, and people have a visceral fear of what's happening to their country or their family's budget or anything, that's a time to talk and reach them. And I'm sure many of you in this room reached that point at some point that got you here.
One person, please. One person.
Yes?
You talked about Americans loving liberty, and you gave 9/11 as an example. Yet still, right after 9/11, they jumped on the Patriot Act, the most liberty-stealing thing ever. And how do you explain that?
Oh, I'm sorry, they jumped on
The
what?
Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act. It's intentionally good.
That's easily explained. They didn't appreciate the implications, the significance, the fact that once a police state starts growing, nothing's going to stop it. They weren't aware of all of these historical antecedents and precedents and the way power works and how power feeds on itself. All they knew was there are terrorists in the world and they don't want their children buried by some terrorist explosion, and if the Patriot Act will stop it, then okay, what's wrong with the Patriot Act? So it was just naivete if you want to be polite, ignorance if you don't want to be
Or
polite.
stupidity if your name is Gruber.
But they voted for it again. They
For
voted for it again.
the same reason. If some future administration starts arresting people and the FISA court starts issuing subpoenas allowing for getting private communication, and there are cases where this really explodes into public view and people see how the danger that the Patriot Act represents, then people will wake up. But it's just like everything else. It's ignorance, naivete, stupidity. They're just not aware that power is the greatest danger on the face of the earth. Power feeds itself, it is never satisfied, it always grows, and you have to watch it and keep it under checks and balances and chains. And most people have no idea that is so, or that it poses a danger. But that's naivete.
Our media is a big
And that's a huge, huge problem, but it's a problem that comes out of the universities. Like Rush Limbaugh always says, you ask a journalist why they became a journalist, to change the world. Not to simply explain the news, just to change the world. And they have that mentality. And that is the greatest of problems. But there is a Fox News, and Fox News earns more in advertising revenue than CBS, NBS, and ABS. It's all BS. That's Rush Limbaugh. And there is the Washington Examiner, the Washington Free Beacon, the New York Post. There are papers with a more objective slant and a more conservative slant that are gaining readership all over the country. And Fox News, talk radio is alive and well everywhere. It's amazing. I drive out to friends in Florida or in Indiana, and I don't have to go 2 miles without catching one station or another with some conservative talk host. no, I never heard of in most cases. So the battle isn't lost. It is a battle, and I don't know if we will survive it. To be very honest, nobody asked, but I believe that the dark ages will descend over America in 40 years, unless something can be done to right what is so wrong about the direction we're going. And all we can do as individuals is to try to wake our neighbors up, build a giant movement, but that movement, in my view, as I said in my talk, cannot just be for tax reform or to pass a constitutional balanced budget amendment, which will take 8 years, if it ever gets passed. Even the Convention of the States idea of the Article 5 plan Mark Levin proposes, it'll take way too long, and in the interim, government will grow, and the troubles will mount. That's why the root of the problem is welfare, and the only solution is an all-out assault on the welfare state as such. My tweet is defund Obamacare, then dismantle the rest of the welfare state, make government a protector, not a provider. That sums up the whole talk. A pleasure. Can I get a business card?
Absolutely. In fact, you'll appreciate my quote. It's not mine, obviously, but you need my glasses. You want me to read it to you?
Jerome, I want to thank you very much for your talk this evening. It was very riveting, as you can see. As you can see, everybody spent a lot of good time here, and it was very interesting. Jerome, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Ray. One quick thing, you want to just mention your book before we close here?
This talk was inspired and informed by chapters of my book, which just came out last August, a revision of a book I originally published in 1980, actually, makes the case so much more. There are chapters that bring everything up to date, and as I said, all the themes I touched on, and I threw a lot of information at you and a lot of opinions and ideas, and if you want to digest them slowly, book is available for $15. And the other book, Lock in America, is the source of my deeper understanding of the principles of the country. And that you have to pay what I pay for, $25. I don't get any discount at all.
I just want to ask you one question. Do you have tenure?
No.
They won't give you tenure.
I'm not. I was not on a tenure track. I would not have accepted a tenure track if it was offered for me. If you're in a university, it's a strange, you get a 2-year contract if you're going for tenure or not, and then they renew the contract after 2 years, and then later, there's only one choice a university has: give you tenure or fire you. You can't work for more than 6 years at any university. If they don't give you tenure, they fire you. I've never been on the tenure track. I'm going into my 9th year working there. It's a private Roman Catholic university, Seton Hall. They get such great reports from my students that I don't know what mischief they're engaged in to continue giving me 1-year contracts. But I heard from the director of the program that I'm teaching under that those 1-year contracts will come as long as I want them.
How are the students with you? I mean, because you have all the young ones. How
Yeah,
do they
as a matter of fact, I only teach freshmen and sophomores. Freshmen, I teach a course called Journey of Transformation, and sophomores, Christianity and Culture and Dialogue. I treat Christianity and culture as intellectual history, the story of the rise of Western culture, the ideas that created it, and the ideas that are tearing Western culture down. So I do that. Journey of Transformation, I treat as moral philosophy. Now, my students all are the children of blue-collar workers. These are not the educated elites at all. Their parents scrimped and saved to escape Brooklyn or Queens or Staten Island and buy a little piece of property in the suburbs of New Jersey. They sent their kids to parochial schools all their time. And what I hear most often from my students is I sound just like their parents. So I have a great, and not only that, but I'm hired to teach these core courses that every freshman and sophomore has to take. I'm hired under the classical studies department, even though I don't know 3 words of Greek or 4 words of Latin. And I'm hired under classical studies, even though my PhD is in political science. They didn't have an opening in political science when they wanted to hire me, and so they put me in classical studies. But because of that, I don't deal with a single colleague. I'm a professor by stealth. I see my students, I teach 4 classes a day, get in my car and drive back to Brooklyn. I don't have to do assignments for the chairs of the department. I don't have to attend departmental meetings where I have to interact with people I despise, namely my colleagues.
So I couldn't retain you for an hour, like me? No, I'm serious. If we're up to something, like I'm against the chemtrails. You know, they're fumigating us every day.
I can't help
But
you.
I want to write a letter, but I wanted someone to check it. You know, not to a politician, but just, you know, they should be
No,
arrested.
I would be happy to do it,
There you
no
go.
charge,
Yeah.
if it's an issue that I myself feel strongly about. I'm a good writer.
You were right on the money saying, you know, arrest these people, and then we need to arrest them.
Yeah.
Chemtrails?
Well, there's
Geoengineering.
We're gonna end the meeting. Jerome, I want to thank you very much for
Thank you
coming
very
this
much.
evening. If anyone has any other questions, we'll be here for a
Yeah,
little
I'll
while.
get answers.